People get upset because the church has this however big reserve. The second question you've got to ask is it being misused? My name's Casey Griffiths.
Hello, Casey.
You earn a master's in religious education.
Church History Matters podcast.
Let me deal with a couple big assumptions. People would say, they have all this money, why are they building this nice building when they could be out feeding poor people?
That's a common question that I hear a lot.
Yeah.
Are there leaders in the church that get paid? Can we put some clarity on that?
Do we see the president of the church driving a gold-plated Lexus?
We have enough money in the reserve. What if we just stop paying tithing? What is the church doing as an organization?
I could give you the stats on the humanitarian efforts of the church. I think that that's just a numbers game. Let's back the truck up a little bit and let's talk about the principles behind it.
Like, what would the world be like if everybody lived this way? Can you imagine?
That would be huge, right?
I don't think 100 billion is enough.
We kind of live in an era when there's not a lot of institutional trust. Right? You see a big institution, and I think the instinct of a 21st century person, and this might not be a bad instinct, by the way, is to be like, big organizations are scary, and they're usually up to no good, and there's usually something fishy about them. And so when it was reported that our church, had this huge financial reserve, there was automatically this suspicion of, hey, what's going on? Why do these people have so much money, and why are they hoarding it? Was the word that I heard used a lot. Like, why aren't they putting it out there? Then there's a whole group of voices that kind of assail the corporate structure of the church. That our church is sort of unique, where most churches are led by really charismatic, theologians and preachers, guys like you, and our church seems to be like these, white collar guys that seem sort of nerd. It's like a bunch of accountants, and things like that. And they're confused because when they see the leaders of our church and the officers of our church, they don't seem like what we're accustomed to seeing a Christian minister to be like, right?
Yeah.
And both of those things speak towards two of the real strengths of the church, in my mind. One is this huge financial reserve comes because the church has harnessed the tools of business to gather resources, to find new and unconventional ways to meet the problems that we face. And the second is that the church isn't exclusively led by guys like you or me, who have backgrounds in teaching or in philosophy or in religion. If you run down the ranks of the First Presidency in the Quorum of the 12, you've got a heart surgeon, a Supreme Court judge, a business professor, and then when you go down the 12, you've got one religious educator there. There's Jeffrey R. Holland, right? But as you go down, you've got an airline pilot and a CEO of a corporation and another heart surgeon, where they come from all these different aspects of life, and their ability to preach a powerful sermon isn't the first reason why we choose them. We choose them because they're great teachers, because they're great disciples, but also because they have skill sets in a number of backgrounds. And so sometimes it's weird for people to see that the church is acquiring resources and growing and using business methodology to do so. Because in a more traditional Christian church, they wouldn't sit down and say, hey, we had a focus group on this, or we did some research on how efficient this is. Like most Christian religions, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing either, are operated sort of by feel. But because the people that run the church come from all kinds of different backgrounds, they've been willing to leverage the tools of business to make the church more efficient, to make the church more effective, to help the church do more good. And that's actually a really, really great thing, because corporate structure, when it comes down to it, is there for a reason. Business people are trying to look at the maximum way to accrue profits. We're just using those tools to try and say, what's the maximum good we can do with the resources that we have? Because we have limited resources. Even if we have $100 billion, that's finite. And we're trying to figure out the best way to help people.
So this is a topic that is close to people's heart, because I think financial things, money is what we use, right, to buy things. But in this perspective of what you're bringing to the table, is it might be kind of strange to people, because they're like, what are they really doing? Because it's kind of away from the expectation, but it's to a lot of people, that's still a lot of money.
Yeah.
Right? You have a unique perspective that's a little bit more than just the ins and outs of the financial side, right?
Right.
Because I think the question that we want to really consider today is, okay, so what is behind the financial success of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints?
Yeah.
And I think that if people really knew, I think it wouldn't be what they would expect.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So maybe we should just backtrack, because your expertise is in the history. You have the Church History Matters podcast that you have.
Yeah, I work on Church History Matters.
That's also a part of Scripture Central. And what you do oftentimes is you kind of go through and help people understand the context and background, right?
Yeah.
So can we start there? What is the background of the church? Like, we talk about how it is today. What was it like at the very beginning?
Any organization, if you want to understand why it does, what it's about, and what its values are, you go back to the beginning, right? Why was it founded? Where was it coming from? What were the principles they started with? And Latter-day Saints and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are no different. People focus on angels and new revelations and gold plates, and, well, they should. Miracles are a foundational part of our worldview and how we see things. We see God as a living God who continues to engage with people. But they also need to understand what the early saints were trying to accomplish and what their aims and goals were, and how those aims and goals have continued down to this day. So, for instance, one of the prominent symbols of the church that people see all over the place are these temples that are popping up all over, right?
Yeah.
And we're building temples at a more rapid pace than we ever have before. But a lot of people don't understand what goes on inside the temples or why temples matter that much. And that's another angle where people would say, they have all this money, why are they building this nice building?
Yeah.
When they could be out feeding poor people.
That's a common question that I hear a lot. Yeah.
And what they don't understand is that inside the temple is where Latter-day Saints commit to live the law of consecration. So, yeah, we're building a nice building, and we want it to look nice, and we hope that it's a symbol that draws people to the church and also expresses our idea of the concept of immortality. President Hinckley said that every temple that's built is a monument to Latter-day Saints' belief that there is more beyond this life, that there's an eternity waiting for us. But inside the temple, a lot of things happen that are designed specifically to affect the here and now. And in the last couple of years, the church has become a lot more willing to talk about what happens inside the temple. David A. Bednar actually gave this talk where he kind of said, here's what's okay to to talk about, and here's what it's okay to not talk about.
Yeah, and there's a whole site directed towards it.
There's a whole site directed towards it. And if I can just summarize what Elder Bednar said, it was basically, there's certain things in the temple that you covenant to not talk about outside the temple. Not because it's evil or it's secret, but because it's sacred. But he said, in a general sense, the principles and commandments and things that are taught in the temple, we can talk about. Most of them are in the scriptures to begin with. And one of the things that they've published in the last few years that has been really, really helpful is the 5 covenants that a person makes when they go through the temple. It's the law of obedience, law of sacrifice, the law of the gospel, the law of chastity, and the law of consecration. And just knowing that this is what a person is committing to do makes a big difference for a person who's getting ready to go to the temple, or for a person who might not ever go inside the temple but just wants to know, hey, what are you guys doing when you're inside there? And so obedience and sacrifice are 2 things that I think everybody's familiar with. They know. Yeah. And they know that that's part of Christian religion, right? That you covenant to obey commandments, that you sacrifice in order to make the world a better place. Law of the gospel is tied directly to Jesus Christ and his atoning sacrifice, that you believe in following the example of Jesus Christ. And because of that, you receive his grace and it helps you. Law of chastity is also fairly self-explanatory too, right? But the law of consecration is interesting because I think it's okay for me to say this, but in the temple, they actually say the law of consecration as found in the Doctrine and Covenants.
That's right.
And it's sort of a challenge in the temple liturgy to actually say, this one's a little more complex. I need you to go and open up a book and read about this and understand it. And it's complex because the laws regarding sacrifice and obedience and chastity are the same. Human bodies work the same today as they worked thousands of years ago. But the laws of finance, the world that we find ourselves in when it comes to things like consecration is radically different than it was even when the Restoration was initiated around 200 years ago. So,
in what ways?
well, I mean, for example, Joseph Smith receives Section 42 of the Doctrine and Covenants, which contains the Law of Consecration in 1831. In 1831, it was a barter economy. Like the United States government literally did not print paper money in 1831. They minted coins. There were things like banks. But the honest truth is that the monetary system as we understand it right now was totally different. You'd go to your neighbor and say, hey, I'll give you 3 chickens if I can have 2 bags of flour.
Yeah.
And that was basically how you worked. And because of the limitations of travel, your local bank would literally print bank notes
To
that
be
you
equal.
could take and turn in for $5 in gold or whatever, anything like that. Today, I mean, in the last 20 years, we've practically ceased using paper money altogether, right?
That's true, actually.
When I left the country for the first time a couple of years ago, I was all nervous about exchanging currency. And, am I going to have enough? I was going to Israel. I was like, am I going to have enough shekels to, pay for my ice cream?
And now
I got there and everybody had, contactless pay, or Apple Pay or things like that. And the way that we do things is just so radically different. But for some reason, we haven't made the mental shift to say, all right, this is what consecration looked like in 1831 when it was revealed. But we don't sit down and ask hard questions like, well, what does consecration look like in 2024?
So God has created a law
Yeah.
that is really founded on how he's going to provide for his people.
Yeah.
Right? And so the first example of that is whenever you go through the temple, it's in section 42 when he dispenses this law to them historically, right?
Well, I mean, it starts in section 42, but essentially in section 42, it's 12 verses. Section 42 is called the Law of the Church, but it contains several different laws. Here's what I want you to teach. He reiterates some of the oldest commandments. Here's how you heal people is another part of section 42. But verses 30 to 42 is the Law of Consecration. And if there's a verse that's kind of like the heart of the law, it's verse 30. The Lord says, thou wilt remember the poor and consecrate of thy properties for their support, which thou hast to import unto them with a covenant and a deed which cannot be broken. And so just that verse alone suggests a couple of things. Number one, it's a commandment in the church to remember the poor. Number two, he says you have to consecrate or make your properties sacred. And the earliest version of this revelation doesn't say consecrate of thy properties. It says consecrate all thy properties. That's
Give
the wording.
everything.
Yeah. Later on, they adjusted it for a number of different reasons. But then it says with a covenant and a deed, which cannot be broken. In other words, I command you to remember the poor. Consecrate means to make sacred. Like if I were to consecrate my house to God, it means that I'm dedicating it and saying it's here whenever you need to use it. You're actually the owner. You're just recognizing ownership. And then the part with a covenant and a deed is maybe the most impactful part because he's saying we have a system for doing this. So a lot of Christian thought is, oh yeah, in general, you're supposed to take care of the poor. So if I see a guy on the street and he's hungry, I should get him some food or something like that. But the Law of Consecration suggests, no, let's pool our resources and let's come up with an organized system to sort of deal with the issue of poverty, to make sure that everybody's taken care of, and let's do it in a systematic way so that we can make a bigger impact. Because you're a great guy, and I have no doubt that you have charity for people, but the two of us together, and then 4 more, and then 8 more, it becomes exponential in the difference that we can make in kind of impacting these problems. So 1 billion people out there all on their own doing good can probably do less good than, say, 100,000 people that are well organized and pooling their resources to really seriously address the problem.
Yeah. So I think this is really interesting because a lot of people, when they think of the temples even and think of like the different covenants of the temple, it's almost as if it's just, oh, these are the things that I'm going to do right or wrong. But this sounds like it's more of a community, societal commitment, right?
Yeah.
That we can get more together than we can just individually, you know?
Yeah.
What I thought would be interesting to do is to go back to like what is the original context that brings us to this point now?
Okay.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But even before that, I want to kind of go deeper into what are the things that people assume? What do people assume that the church does with church finance? What do people think that it is that we do?
Let me deal with a couple big assumptions.
Okay.
The first one is we don't live the law. We don't live the law of consecration. If an average student or person that you talk to in the church, even if they're very knowledgeable, might say, well, we used to live the law of consecration. It was really difficult. It happened mostly in Joseph Smith's time. It was so challenging, the Lord repealed it and gave us a lesser law, which is the law of tithing. But that's crazy, right? We commit to live the law of consecration in the temple alongside the law of chastity. If I came to you and said, we used to live the law of chastity, but it was too hard. So the Lord gave us a lesser law, but someday we'll live it. Be realistic. That just doesn't fit with what we've been taught, right?
Well, isn't it because is it mostly because people think that like the United Order that didn't work and then it was abandoned? Is that the reason why they probably didn't?
That's part of it. Is basically the common narrative is the law of tithing replaced the law of consecration.
Okay.
But that's misunderstanding the law of tithing and the law of consecration. Tithing is a financial law. It has to do with the amount of income that you have. Consecration is holistic. When I'm consecrating, it might be that I'm giving 10% of my increase to the Lord, but it also might be I'm giving a bunch of my time to go and serve. It might be that I have this unique talent. I can fix a car, and so I'm going over to a person's house and helping fix it. It might be that I don't have any real skills, but I've got time and I've got energy. I can go over and help cut someone's lawn that can't cut their lawn or clean their house. All of that's consecration. It's holistic. And I would say tithing is a subset of the law of consecration and the law of sacrifice. It's kind of a modern application of those two laws combined together.
So when it comes to the law of consecration specifically, people don't believe or they don't really understand that we still live it today.
Yeah, that's part of the problem is people see it as some kind of future ideal that someday we'll attain to, but right now it's not realistic to live. When in reality, all throughout the Doctrine and Covenants, the Lord was challenging them to find a way to help people. It's just what's given in section 42 isn't the last word on consecration. Consecration is probably mentioned more in the Doctrine and Covenants than anything except for maybe the mission of Jesus Christ and the work of salvation. But I mean, by one breakdown, about a third of the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants deal with consecration. And the reason why it keeps popping up is because they're making adjustments. Okay, that didn't work. Let's try this. This happened.
The way that they carry it out, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, the way that they carry it out. So for instance, an example would be originally there were two United Orders. There was one that was in Kirtland and there was one that was in Missouri because there's two church centers. In Section 104, the church center in Missouri has collapsed because of persecution. They've been kicked out of their homes and now they're refugees. So the Lord says, let's adjust. Let's make one consecrated order and it'll govern the whole church and then we'll go from there. A couple of years later, when Section 119 is given, the Lord says, okay, everybody consecrate your properties. And after that, we'll have you give 10% of your increase. That's where the law of tithing is initiated. But all along the way, he's tweaking and adjusting and changing consecration, suggesting that it's not a one set in stone law. It's a set of flexible principles, and the Lord expects us to find the best way to apply them given the circumstances that we're in. Because honestly, Joseph Smith was serious about consecration, but so was Brigham Young. Brigham Young actually just basically told all the settlements in Utah, here's the principles, go figure out what works best for you. And in some places like Brigham City, they live consecration a lot differently than they did in Orderville. In some places like Richfield, consecration flamed out after a year or two. In other places like Orderville and Brigham City, it lasted for a long time, decades.
Yeah.
Brigham City had a kind of cooperative system where they just had shared businesses and they would pool resources and then pull from it to help the community. And that lasted somewhere around 20 to 25 years and was only stopped because the federal government intervened, basically.
But essentially, it's the same core principles. They're being applied in different areas.
They can be applied in different ways.
And the main purpose of it, though, would be for a way for God to care for the poor.
That remembering the poor, that's step one, right? Consecrate your properties, which just means you assume that everything that you have actually belongs to God. And then the step 3 is enter into a covenant and a deed that can't be broken. So you look around and recognize that there's problems. You look at what resources you have that you can give to God to help with the problems, and then you promise to do what you can to help with it. And then we have certain people, mostly bishops and Relief Society presidents, that direct the work of consecration and will come along and say, I mean, I think it's okay for us to mention here, but you're serving as a bishop right now. And so you hold a ward council. Or maybe you just have a welfare meeting privately with the Relief Society president, and you say, hey, this brother in the ward has lost his job, or this sister's going through a divorce. How do we pool our resources to help them? And consecration could be, let's get them a form and send them to the bishop's storehouse so that they have food. It could also be, hey, this single sister has to work and she's not home when her kids get there. So let's find somebody that can check in on her kids and make sure they're okay, or somebody that can manage childcare, or somebody that can drive them to a job interview so that they can get a new job. That's all consecration. Part of it's financial, but it's holistic. It's everything.
So there's this higher law that we're living.
Yeah.
And I think that when people look at church finances, they think, oh, the church just has a lot of money. It's like we're not even thinking about it that way.
Yeah.
We're trying to figure out a way to provide for everyone in need.
Yeah.
And now you even get to the point where you're saying that's more than just financial, right? But essentially we want, I love what it says in section 42. It says like that they would all be, that they would be amply supplied.
Yeah.
Right?
That's the idea.
The ideal would be that everyone, like what is it in Moses where it says they were of one heart and one mind and there were no poor among them.
Yeah.
Right?
And that's part of the misunderstanding too, is when people get upset because the church has this, however big reserve, the second question you've got to ask is it being misused? Like, do we see the president of the church driving a gold-plated Lexus?
No.
Or living large, or he has this huge house up on a mountain, or he's got a private fleet of jets that travel him around, or anything like that. You don't see anything like that. The current president of the church lives in extremely humble circumstances in an apartment that's fairly close to church headquarters, just so he can get to work and get back easily. Yeah.
And he's almost 100.
Yeah, and he
still works.
He's not
a job.
He's not living large and on his 4th marriage and stuff like that. He has consecrated all of his time towards the Lord's work, and you would find that in all the ranks of the church, right? It's partially because there's no corruption as far as I can see when it comes down to it. I guess there was a kerfuffle about a year ago about how the church had kind of put its resources into a number of different companies.
Yeah.
But nobody was saying that anybody was skimming off the top and getting rich or anything.
That's the question. I think that's the thing that is interesting to me. It's like, what is the issue?
Yeah.
Because if you even look at the amount, if we're really trying to take care of the poor, if we're really trying to, it's not enough. It like that the amount, even if you broke it down, right?
Yeah.
It wouldn't be. We had a conversation with Aaron Miller. He's a professor and just an expert basically in governance of like nonprofit organizations. And he basically explained that like if you broke it down, each individual piece, if you were to compare the endowment, it would only be like, I think it was like less than $4,000 a person.
Yeah,
like if you divided it up,
which would be
decent.
I wouldn't say no to, right?
But do you see that? But it kind of gives us some context, and you might say, well, that's not all the members on record and all of that, But I think that it's missing the point that we're doing this for a higher reason. It's not just.
Again, those common criticisms like, hey, why do you have to build all these huge temples? Well, in a temple, thousands of people go in and commit to live the law of consecration. So it's an effective allocation of resources to build a house where we can get a couple thousand more people to commit to live the law of consecration that then go out and do things to make the world a better place.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, let me give you an example. Like when I first came to BYU, I was studying church education, and the church has a number of schools, but we only ever think of BYU, Idaho, LDS business, Ensign College, whatever they call it. The church has a number of K through 12 schools. They're mostly found in the Pacific. And the most difficult one to get to is in Kiribati. It's this island nation in the smack dab middle of the Pacific. I mean, if you count ocean, Kiribati is bigger than the continental United States. But if we're counting just land, I mean, you could fit most of it in Utah County.
Are you serious?
Yeah. And most people live on this atoll called Tarawa, where there was a famous battle fought in World War II. But other than that, nobody's ever heard of it. The atoll is about 40 miles long. At its widest point, it's 800 meters wide. Most places on Tarawa, you can stand in the ocean, throw a rock, it'll land in the ocean on the other side. These people have like no resources, but there's a school there. And because early on I committed to visit all the schools, and I got everywhere except for Samoa, the pandemic stopped me, I went to Kiribati. And first of all, there's barely enough land there to land a plane, so it's pretty nerve-wracking to get there. But immediately they took me to the school, and I realized, you know what, other than coconut trees, they don't have the wherewithal to really produce anything. So why is there a school here? Well, a school is there because the government doesn't provide basic education for everybody. There's a government school and there's a Catholic school and a Protestant school, and Latter-day Saints were kind of missing out. In most places, that's not the case, so the church doesn't build a K through 12 school. In Kiribati, they did need a school. And along the way, these people go to school. The school's incredibly expensive to maintain because, Stephen, I mean, if there's an ocean just like 50 yards this way and 50 yards this way, the salt water alone just eats the buildings. They have to slap a huge layer of paint on it every couple of years so that it just doesn't deteriorate. That's where some of this goes to. And then, I mean, I remember sitting there when I was visiting the school and a family invited me to come over to their house. Their house was a thatched roof. This was one of the more well-off families. They had a freezer.
And you're like, they have a freezer?
They have a freezer. So they were like, do you want a popsicle? Like, this was just amazing stuff for them. No walls on the house. Wow. The place where they're at right near the equator is so pleasant that it's pretty much 88 degrees every day. And the weather is pretty nice. They don't experience many typhoons. We're helping these people. And at the time, you know, I was like, well, how much, you know, I shouldn't have asked this, but what's your average annual income here? Have you been to the temple? Yeah, we saved for 20 years. And then we took all 8 of our kids to Fiji because Fiji was the closest temple, right? So just getting to the temple was a huge deal for them. When I got back about a year afterwards, they announced that a temple was going to be built in Kiribati.
Wow.
And first of all, just getting the materials to this island is going to be a huge deal, right? Having the construction happen in a place that's as remote as this. But why build the temple in Kiribati? It's not a smart business decision. Financially, it doesn't make much sense. Operating a school in Kiribati doesn't make a ton of sense. But making sure that the people there have education and a chance to advance and a place where they can go and create eternal families and make covenants that allow them to live consecrated lives really is a good investment for us. We don't do it because we make a ton of money. We do it because we want their quality of life to increase. And for those that want to stay on the island and just do what their forebears have done for generations and generations, great. Here's a basic education so you can have a little upward mobility. For others, I mean, while I was in Kiribati, just down the road from the school was the Institute. And I walked in and there was a girl sitting on a laptop. And I said, what are you doing? I'm taking an accounting class through Pathways. So she'll probably become upwardly mobile enough that she might want to eventually leave the island and go somewhere where she has greater opportunities. But that's just one sample of maybe 1,000 of different places around the church and where these resources go to. Like, we're not going to make any money building a temple in Kiribati. We don't make any money building a temple in Taylorsville. But we get people committed to live the law of consecration inside the temple, and then they go out and they make a difference in the world that they're at.
I just think that some people might wonder, they could use that money to give people food.
Yeah.
Right? And but what I'm understanding you say is that there's something deeper that is believed that would like that, like because you can always tell what something's worth by how much somebody's willing to pay for it.
Yeah.
And that's not always monetary. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. It's the oldest saying in the world, but give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day. Teach a man to fish, he'll eat for a lifetime. And all those things, what we're trying to do is to get them to kind of see the world through consecrated eyes. And then it's not just going to be that they ate for a day. It's that they're going out and providing for themselves, seeing the importance of their family and providing for them, and then using their resources to bless and help other people. Like we're investing in people, essentially. When we build the temple, we're investing in the local people to help them gain a consecrated viewpoint, and then they can go out and make a huge difference.
What are some of the things that the church is doing now? The church is so you have it on an individual basis, but what is the church doing as an organization to live this law of consecration with the funds that they have?
Okay.
That you know of.
Okay. Well, boy, where to begin? Because this is a whole other hour-long conversation. There's humanitarian work. There's educational work that gets done. There's individual humanitarian. So on the one hand, when we think of humanitarian work, we think, there was an earthquake on the other side of the world. Let's ship some hygiene kits there. Let's get them so that they're okay. On the other hand, the church and its humanitarian work is largely carried out by training members to be humanitarians. I served my mission in southern Florida. And a couple years before I got there, this was in the 90s, Hurricane Andrew came through southern Florida, completely wiped out this little town called Homestead, just to the south of Miami. This guy that I met on my mission, who's passed away now, his name was Terrence Berry, gathered together the local church membership and said, those are our neighbors, let's go help them. And when they were contacting them, they said, we need some way to identify you when you go in, because this is a disaster area. There's looting, there's lawlessness. So he went to this local t-shirt place and said, what's the cheapest color t-shirt? They said, nobody likes yellow t-shirts. So, okay, give me a bunch of yellow t-shirts and print Mormon helping hands on them. So they gave everybody that was going into the disaster zone a yellow shirt that said Mormon helping hands. And then they went down and they started helping and assisting. For 3 months, the members of the church in southern Florida met on Sunday, took the sacrament, went home, got their tools, and went to Homestead and helped their neighbors dig out. And so on one hand, we have these large-scale humanitarian efforts that are organized by the church. On the other hand, local stake leaders, local wards, constantly do this kind of humanitarian work where they're organized. And they're constantly searching their neighborhoods to try and find it. Like one of the things I was told when I was set apart as a bishop was help the people that come to you, but also seek out the people that need help as well. Yeah. Now, in doing so and in giving help, we have to balance this idea of independence, which is what is the person doing to improve their own situation, and what can we do to help them get better as well? To
actually make
to
help
and sometimes
them long term,
sometimes the humanitarian work the church does is to sit down with somebody and say, here's all the government programs. Are you aware of these? Let's sign you up. Let's get you going. Just to kind of increase that. That's part of consecration.
And people pay taxes. That's what taxes do.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. But I mean, all of this starts basically with the spiritual work of the church, where we teach correct principles, just like Joseph Smith taught, and then we allow people to go out and do good. So honestly, I couldn't even start to catalog the number of things that the members of the church do. Now, I've had an opportunity to travel to some places that are especially in need of help, like Kiribati and Tonga and other countries where the church does obvious humanitarian work. But I would say, is there a humanitarian need in places like Springville, Utah? Oh, yeah, huge. And we also try to meet those needs as well. But the biggest thing we do is we're creating this structure, this organized communal effort that exists all over the world, anywhere there's a ward, where we have a rapid response, fast, let's get in there and let's help the person as soon as we can. Because I mean, on a basic level, is consecration, is it humanitarian work if your neighbor calls you and says, my wife's going to the hospital, can you come over and watch our kids? Yeah, that's essentially valuable. And having a couple million people that are trained and know how to do that and have covenanted to do so makes a big difference as well.
Oh, I know that one of the things I remember too is historically, they've raised money fast when they literally fast.
Yeah.
Like, was it President Harold B. Lee people were in need, and they're like, we're going to hold a fast, and literally, you're going to spend this much money on these meals, and then we're going to all put it to this one fund, and they raise a couple million like that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, literally, think of what the world could do if we were all like, we're going to not eat for 2 meals. We'll live.
LDS Humanitarian Services
Yeah.
actually started because of the Ethiopian famine that happened back in the early 80s.
Whoa.
And there was a church-wide call for a fast. All the money from the fast was donated to help these people in Ethiopia, where the church wasn't established, by the way, to just help our brothers and sisters that were there. And that's another amazing thing, too, is to say, hey, we've got a group of people that are willing to give up 2 meals once a month and give that money towards it. If everybody did that, that would be huge, right?
Can you imagine if once a month in the world, everybody gave up 2 meals and put the cost towards hunger?
Yeah.
I mean, the people who do have, nobody, I think that alone, I don't know, I have to calculate it, but I bet that would do damage if they did it on a monthly basis, right?
Yeah, absolutely. How many billions of dollars does that account for? And how
If
much
everybody
does it help?
paid 10% and it's all equal, and if you didn't have enough, then you would get enough. I mean, that is like, to me, so simple. But again, it's the trust that it takes in order for us to be willing to do that everybody would be willing to share.
It's organizing this group that's willing to go out in a unified way and help. And honestly, it's difficult for us to catalog that. Like, I could give you the stats on the humanitarian efforts of the church, that they just donated $57 million and stuff like that. But I think that's, when it comes down to it, just a numbers game.
Yeah.
If a person wants to understand why I see the church as a good organization, they've got to understand the principles behind it and why we commit to live those principles and what it actually means. And so usually when somebody comes up and says, hey, what about this, multi-billion-dollar trust fund set up by the church, I say, let's back the truck up a little bit and let's talk about consecration and the principles that the church is built on and what the church exists to do. Because there is this feel today in the world like, I'm spiritual but not religious. I can worship at home just as well as I can at church. Yeah. And that might be true. Like, I know some very spiritual people that aren't affiliated with a church.
Yeah.
But can you do as much good? Can you help as many people if you're not attached to a larger organization? Like, I mean, I can be spiritual and read the Bible at home, but if I'm part of an organization where I'm constantly reminded and taught, and I'm meeting together just 2 hours every Sunday, I mean, just those 2 hours that we go to church, the contact connection. How you doing? It looks like you're kind of tired. Well, I'm stressed. I lost my job. How many deep connections are made there during those 2 hours when we meet as a community that empower us and allow us to go out and do good? And so, I mean, yeah, you can do more good if you're part of a church than if you're just a spiritual person. And I mean, I would suggest in my mind that the most effective organization I know to help people is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But if you feel like that's not for you, find an organization to attach yourself to. Find someone that aligns with your values. Become part of something bigger. Because, I mean, the way we're set up right now is we're being micro-divided into smaller and smaller demographics and groups. To the point to where, I only want to talk to people that believe in this and this and this. And the Lord's objective is to bring us together, get us bigger and bigger and bigger so that we're all united and so that we're not creating these artificial boundaries that sometimes cause serious, serious problems. When I see you as a child of God and see everybody as a child of God, it's fundamentally different than when I'm trying to create boundaries, which really is what we're being driven to do right now by the societal trends.
I love that's what Moses said after he saw everything. He said, I know now that I'm nothing.
Yeah, I'm part of a.
Not that he's not important, but just like, it's not just me.
Yeah.
It's like this huge thing that's bigger than me.
That's another one of those paradoxes, right?
Yeah.
The worth of a soul is great in the sight of God, but souls combined together can do so much good that exists in the world. You're someone that's individual that God knows and that God loves personally, but you're also a part of this big work. And there are days when it's important for me to know that I'm an individual that God loves, and there's other days when it's important for me to know I'm part of something bigger. I'm doing something that's bigger than just me. And what I do is small, but it makes an effort because there's a lot of people out there who have my back and are doing the same thing.
It's like it's this completely different thing.
Yeah. I mean, I love to read the scriptures on my own, but this morning I went to the temple, and man, it's nice to walk into the temple and just be like, man, all these people are here and they're not getting paid, and they're here because they love God. Like, just being with them I was there for 45 minutes. Made a huge difference. And I walked into my old bishop, who I haven't seen in years, was the guy who was officiating at the ceremony I met.
Oh, cool.
And to look and say, hey, he's still in the fight. He's still on a daily basis. I haven't seen him in 6 years, but when I see him in the temple, I know that he's engaged in the same kind of work I'm doing, that he sees value in pushing against the darkness. And so I'm going to go out and push too.
This one fact you said, they don't get paid. I want to consider the question.
Yeah.
Because I think it's a misconception, because I know that there are leaders in the church that do get paid.
Yeah.
Right? Can we put some clarity on that when it comes to this original, even the original Revelation? There's a lot of clarification in that.
Yeah, that's been a funny thing. There in the Revelations, actually, I should say the first bishop of the church, Edward Partridge, was paid.
Yeah, it's in there.
It's in the scriptures that basically, if a person's going to devote all of their time to the service of God, that they should be taken care of and cared for. But I mean, the history of the church also attests to the fact that, boy, they don't get rich in this service, right?
Yeah.
Like we already talked about President Nelson and his circumstances. I remember reading through some stuff that John A. Widtsoe was president of the University of Utah, and then he's called to be an apostle. And in his journal, he wrote about how he was going to have to sell one of his cars because he was going to get a stipend to live on, but it wasn't nearly as much as he's making as a university president. Now, flash forward a couple of years ago, there was this organization called Mormon Leaks that was supposed to be like WikiLeaks.
Yeah.
And they leaked President Eyring's stipend. Like, how much money does President Eyring get from the church? And they thought it was going to be this moment that was like, boom, like these Latter-day Saint leaders are making a ton of money.
Like millions.
President Eyring was a university president, before he was called.
He was
as an apostle.
He was on the track to be the president of Stanford.
Yeah. Like, I mean, the average university president, when they put up President Eyring's salary, was making something like 7 or 8 times more than he was. So he made a huge sacrifice. Like, he lives a consecrated life. And if he'd stayed on as a university president, he could have made a ton of money.
Consulting,
but instead, he sees the work of the Lord as more important. So I don't have any heartburn over that, honestly, because general officers of the church have to commit full time to travel, to ministry, to helping others. They got to eat,
to
right?
run it.
Yeah. They got to provide for their families. But the general officers of the church make up less than like 0.1% of 1% of the entire officership of the church. Like, an individual serving on a ward level typically doesn't get paid. And how high do you have to go up before somebody even gets a stipend? They have to be a general officer of the church.
And they're doing it full time. And I mean, and again, it is relative too,
Yeah.
right? There's a verse that it actually says it. Which verse? Do you remember what verse it is in section 43?
I'm trying to remember.
It's like, there's an actual verse. It's like,
you can see it going back to even places like section 24, where Joseph Smith is clearly worried. Like, the context is that Joseph Smith is really worried about his family. And there's a feeling that after Joseph was done translating the Book of Mormon, things are done. Yeah, the book's out there. The church is organized. Great. Now I can go and be a farmer and be done with...
It's like, no.
But the Lord actually says this, be patient. This is section 24, verse 8. Be patient in afflictions. Thou shalt have many. Endure them. I'm with thee even unto the end of days. In temporal labors, thou shalt not have strength. That's not thy calling. Attend to thy calling, and thou shalt have wherewith to magnify thy office, expound all scriptures, and continue in laying on the hands and confirming the churches. And I mean, in the very next section, which is the revelation to Emma Smith, this is his wife. The Lord basically has to tell her, it's going to be okay. You're going to be taken care of. This will be all right. I'm okay with that idea. Like, I don't think what sets us apart from other churches is this lay clergy that we have, which is amazing and I think is an incredible system. But some members of the church get paid. If I found out today that my bishop in my ward was receiving a stipend because he probably puts in 20 or 30 extra hours a week, I'd be fine with that. That's totally okay. But the simple fact of the matter is there's never been a time in the history of the church when anybody from the president of the church down was making bank or printing money off these things. They all lived consecrated lives of service where they gave themselves to the work of the Lord and didn't try to live in any kind of luxury or make a ton of money because they understand what it's all about. They understand where happiness actually lies, which is in serving and not necessarily counting your money.
For the rest of their life.
Yeah, for the rest of their life. So, I mean, when it comes to financial matters of the church, that's one thing that I go back to again and again. Oh, the church has all this money. Well, is anybody getting rich?
Well, I mean, even on the salary, but also from the very beginning in the establishment of that first revelation, they even create businesses, right, in order to fund the efforts of the church too. And I think that's important to remember. From the beginning, that was the case, and I know that it's changed over time, and that's what you see even today. The church continues to do that.
Yeah,
they continue to.
Like I said, the unique makeup of the church has made it so that you've got a diverse group of leaders coming from a number of different backgrounds, and everybody coming from their background is going to say, "Hey, I've got a tool that could help us." If a person comes from an academic background, it's like, hey, are you aware of historical methodology and how it could help us tell our story in a better way? This person comes from business and finance, says, hey, are you aware that mutual funds are somewhere where we could invest the money of the church and create resources that can help more and more people? And as I understand it, that's essentially where the landfall came from, was these church resources that exist that we use to try and help people. But I mean, the people that get upset about it usually engage in a shallow way. Like, I'll give you an example. The church owns an amusement park. The church owns a theme park in Hawaii, right? The Polynesian Cultural Center, which is the number one tourist attraction in the Hawaiian Islands, is owned by the church. And you'd sit there and say, why does the church own a theme park? That's
what would
weird,
what would the better question be?
Yeah. Why? Yeah.
Why does the church? What is the church doing with the money from the theme park?
Yeah. You go to the PCC, and one of the things that you notice right away is it's separated from BYU Hawaii by a chain link fence. Most of the people that work at the PCC are students at BYU Hawaii who come from all these diverse nations to get an education, and the town that BYU Hawaii is in, Laie, just doesn't have enough jobs for these kids to pay for schooling. So why does the church have a theme park? It's a welfare project. These kids go and work at the theme park. The first time I went to the PCC, we walked into the Tahitian pavilion, and there's this girl making a palm frond hat, and I walked up to her and started talking to her. And then I said, do you feel like you're being exploited for your labor? And she didn't even look up for making her hat. She goes, well, people like you come here and pay $20 for a hat. And I was doing this for free back home. So who's actually being exploited here?
Yeah, wow.
And I was like, oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's weird to say the church owns a theme park, but if that's a tool that helps us build Zion, helps get these kids education, and then hopefully gets them back to their country where now they have a degree, now they can be a leader in their industry, and that gives them more resources to bless and send other people to school, that's great. We just found a weird tool that can help us further the work of the Lord. Why aren't we doing this in all professions?
But it started from the very beginning, and I think that it's wise to do that. Many nonprofits actually do that. They'll have a for-profit that funds the cause that they're trying to do. Yeah.
But I mean, one thing that makes an organization successful, I really believe, is diversity of skills, right? A lot of churches, I think, struggle because they're all led by the same type of personality, same person. Someone like me or you that likes to talk, that likes to preach, and that's good. That's essential to having a successful religion. But one of the real geniuses of the church is this idea of, hey, this guy's not a good speaker, but he's a killer accountant, right? What can we do with him?
I need that in my life for me.
This person isn't great at teaching little kids, but they're amazing at automotive repair. How do we put them to work? This person can write code, It's amazing to me that a person can build up the kingdom of God by writing software that allows somebody to search out their ancestors. to make family connections and build ordinances, that we can create like an app that has the scriptures on it. Nowadays, instead of mailing somebody a Book of Mormon, we can send them a link via email and they can download gospel library with all the scriptures that we have. We're using all these different tools, and that diversity of skill set really does allow us to do a ton more good than if it was just like guys like you and me who like history and theology and want to talk about it. Let's take this computer science guy and see what he can do and how his skills can help build up the kingdom of God. That is amazing. That's the way it's supposed to be.
Well, I just think that the whole concept is it's way beyond just the financial, and I feel like that's why this conversation is important, right? I think it would be interesting because when I was thinking about this and when we were having this conversation, I want to go to the Book of Moses real quick because I want to think. I'm just trying to think of I want to go back to, because when I think of the Doctrine and Covenants, I think that a lot of times when we think of the past, I oftentimes Section 42, they didn't even have the temple yet. I don't even know if they even knew. On Joseph Smith's mind, they don't even know that they're going to build a temple.
Yeah.
They don't even know what the temple doesn't, that's not even a thing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so I thought it'd be interesting to give a little bit of context behind that. Like, what was the impetus? How did we even get to the point where they even got to where, what did you say before? You can tell what something's, the beginning really gives us insight, right?
The foundation.
The foundation gives us insight.
And before we read this passage, because I think I know right where you're going in the Book of Moses, a guy named Grant Underwood did a survey of early LDS literature to basically say, okay, they have the Book of Mormon. Were they using it? And how were they using it? Because today, if I were to ask you, what are the most quoted passages in the Book of Mormon in the church today? What would you?
1 Nephi 3:7.
1 Nephi 3:7, right? 3 Nephi 11, Moroni 10, 4-5. When Grant reviewed early church publications and just the writings of early church members, the two passages that were quoted the most were 3 Nephi 22 and Ether 13. And those are two ones that, the average member, 3 Nephi 22.
Really?
And Ether 13. 3 Nephi 22 is a passage where the Savior prophesies that there's going to be a city built on the American continent. And then Ether 13 is where Moroni starts quoting the prophet Ether and then starts discoursing on a new Jerusalem that will be built on this land. And he goes out of his way to even say, it's not the old Jerusalem. That's going to be built up too, but there's going to be a new Jerusalem that's going to be built here. And that seems to be what really sort of grabbed the imagination of the early saints, was this idea that, hey, the United States can't just be a city on the hill in that biblical sense that that's what the pilgrims want to build. Now, let's do it. Let's literally build the city. So flash forward a couple months after the church is restored, there's a controversy. This is in Doctrine and Covenants 28 with the Whitmer family. And it was because a member of the Whitmer family, Hiram Page, who's a brother-in-law, is receiving revelations, and he's not authorized to. They didn't even know this. In the early church, basically Joseph Smith had always taught anybody can get a revelation from God, but they hadn't set up the rules of, well, can anybody get a revelation for the whole church? So Hiram Page gets this revelation, and later on the Lord says, well, these didn't really come from me, but they're based around Hiram's desires. And guess what the revelations were about? What? The location of the New Jerusalem. That's what they were all focused on. Let's do this. Let's build this city. Let's do what the Book of Mormon says. So shortly after, in fact, in section 28, which is the revelation that addresses Hiram Page, Lord says, okay, I know you're anxious about the New Jerusalem. Let me give you your first hint. It's going to be on the border of the country. It's going to be on the edge of the United States near unorganized Indian territory. Go there, and then I'll give you the next step. And then it's just a couple weeks after that Joseph Smith starts his biblical translation project. And part of his revelations given is that the prophet Enoch in the book of Genesis wasn't just a great guy who was taken up into heaven, but that Enoch built a city that was taken up into heaven. So they're all being kind of pushed and nudged towards this idea that really captures their imagination, which is, maybe we can do it. We can build a society that's the desire they have.
That's
what they want
to create
do, right?
this society that is unique kind of like in 3rd Nephi that was prophesied, and then the city of Enoch.
Yeah,
right?
let's build this. Let's build it. So read the passage you were going to read, which I'm pretty sure was Moses 7:18. Right?
Yeah, it was 7:18.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But even before 7, I'll read it, that one. So, and the Lord called his people Zion because they were of one heart and one mind and dwelt in righteousness, and there were no poor among them. Right? And it's an interesting chapter because it's very similar to what you see at the beginning of the Book of Mormon with Nephi.
Yeah.
Right, where there was a lot of wickedness around them, and even in Enoch's time, there was a whole bunch of wickedness around them.
Yeah.
And there needs to be a change, a separation from the world, and this is kind of like the foundational principle of what that society would be like.
This is the driving idea, right? This is the model that they're establishing. And they see it as kind of a return to the basics. Near the beginning of the history of the world, Enoch built this city, and they solved most of their societal issues. They were taken up into heaven. The biblical narrative just says Enoch was not, for God took him. It's a singular translation event. Yeah. The book of Moses and Joseph Smith's translation project for the Bible all of a sudden makes it, well, Enoch wasn't taken up by himself. What's the point in going to heaven if you're all by yourself? You know, that could be fun for the first 1,000 years, I guess, but then you've got to ask yourself, well, what do I do for the rest of all time? It's our relationships. It's the people around us that make life worth living. And so the narrative in the book of Moses shifts from, well, Enoch wasn't taken up by himself. His city was taken up with him. And if a group of people can come together and unite in heart and mind, they can enter into God's presence as a community. But they're also not ignoring that next line, which is, and there was no poor among them. So they're very systematically saying, how do we get to where Enoch was? And that's the vision that they're pointed towards, because this passage is revealed, and then right around the same time, section 38 of the Doctrine and Covenants is given.
Which I think is very similar.
Yeah.
Like, if you read section 38, you're like, oh.
Section 38 is basically saying what happened with Enoch is going to happen today. The world's going to get more and more wicked. There's going to be more and more destructions, but I'm going to lead those who choose to out of the world. I want them to be united. I want them to come together. And then the Lord says, and I want you to gather, like physically gather. He commands them at this point in time to go to the Ohio. And he says, when you get there, you're going to be endowed with power from on high, and you receive my law. What's the law? It's section 42. It's the Law of Consecration.
And the whole section it's the Law of Consecration, and it's like the law of that city.
Here's how we're going to actually build the city, right? So the sequence is interesting because Joseph Smith and all the members of the church in New York immediately, to their everlasting credit, give up their farms, give up their homes, sell everything, and move to Ohio. The first revelation given in Ohio is to call a bishop. Who's going to oversee this, who's going to make sure everybody's fed and clothed. Then section 42 gives us the Law of Consecration. And there's just an easy sequence from, the Book of Mormon talks about a New Jerusalem. We got to gather if we're going to build that. What makes Jerusalem special? What makes Jerusalem different from any other city? There's a temple there. And then as the sequence goes on, Joseph Smith eventually travels to the borders of Missouri, and that's where the Lord in section 57 says, this is where the city's going to be built. Now, we've been talking
Jerusalem.
Yeah, the New Jerusalem. But we've been talking about consecration, but a couple other things about the New Jerusalem. You could not have picked a more difficult spot in North America to try and build a religious community like the one the saints are going for than Missouri.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you got there? You've got European settlers less than 6 miles away from Native Americans. They hate the Native Americans.
So real quick before you get into it, basically they go to Ohio.
Yeah, they go to Ohio.
He's like, where does he say that I'll give you my law?
He says, if you go to Ohio, I'll give you my law and an endowment of power.
And at that time they were in?
At that time they're in New York.
So they're in New York. They're like, okay, so they don't even know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So they get to Ohio. And he's like, here's the law.
Here's the Law of Consecration.
And then this new place was going to be in a different place.
Yeah. Right after,
okay.
not too long after section 54, the Lord says, okay, you've made it to Ohio. You've got the law. Here's the next step. I want you to go to Missouri. go to Missouri. We already have missionaries there. Oliver Cowdery led the first mission to this spot. And when you get there, I'll reveal the location of the city of Zion. They get there and he reveals the location of the city of Zion in this place where European settlers, where African Americans, Missouri is a slave state, and Native Americans all mingle together.
It's like
and honestly,
it's like the most controversial, the most complicated place it could actually be.
Yeah, because the members of the church are primarily from the north.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not totally anti-slavery, but they're probably uncomfortable with it. Most of them come from free states. You've got the Native Americans. You've got black slaves that are there. And it's interesting because Joseph Smith actually writes about the first Sabbath in Missouri, the first Sabbath in Zion. And the thing that he notes right there is the diversity and the unity that he saw. Like he in the history of the church says, I beheld, in the original draft, by the way, he says like the descendants of Japheth and the descendants of Ham and the descendants of Shem. He says, I saw Europeans, I saw Native Americans, and I saw African Americans all together worshiping. And I realized this is it. This is the city that we're going to build. So Joseph Smith's view in mind was a consecrated community that was multiracial, multi-ethnic, diverse. That's the city of Zion. And if you know anything about societal conditions in 1830s America, that is really ambitious. Yeah. Like it's less than 2 years after that the church gets kicked out of Jackson County. And one of the big reasons is because of their progressive views when it comes to race and also their consecrated views. So why do Missourians not like the early saints? You've got these religious zealots who come from the north of the United States saying that the Native Americans are a divine people, chosen of God, intended to build the city of Zion. What really kind of breaks the relationship with the Missourians is when W.W. Phelps writes this editorial where he says free people of color should come and settle among us. Like, let's get everybody here. But
he clarified. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. He writes this editorial where he invites all people, regardless of their race or background, to come.
And then they like Craig like actually,
and the Missourians are like
freaked out.
We don't like that. In fact, the mob manifesto that the Missourians issue in Jackson County says they're inviting free people of color, mulattoes, to come and settle among us. They're going to intermarry and destroy our racial purity. What's the other factor? The Latter-day Saints are pooling their resources. They're consecrating to build the city, and that kind of unity is scary.
Why do you think that is? Because I think that it's at the core of a lot of the issues that why we have issue with it.
We still run into it today, you know.
I think it's fear.
I do interfaith dialogue, and you know, in one of our sessions with another church, like somebody said something like, "Do you guys ever disagree?" And I was like, of course, we disagree all the time. And they were like, you just seem like you're so on the same page. And he was being very frank. And he said, and that's scary. Like,
why is that so scary?
Because again, it's
not normal.
It's that idea of you have a bunch of people show up in your community and they're committed to do something all together. And
they're unified.
And if you're not in that circle, it is kind of scary, right?
Like you might not be with the unified.
You're looking at them and saying, what's going on? Is this some kind of cult? Because that's another word that gets thrown around with the church, right?
I just think that's interesting.
But if the ideals are good, unity is essential for us to do what we need to do. We just have done a really lousy job kind of teaching what our ideals are and what our intent actually is when we come into a community. Our unity frightens people, but it's because they don't know what we're united in and what we're united in trying to do.
Well, I think what's interesting, but so they try it. They try to live this way.
Yeah.
They get the law. They try to live this way. But it doesn't work every time.
No, it doesn't.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I think that's the interesting part to me is because the assumption is that the law is because of, okay, we're the unified. What are they unified in? It's like, oh, wait, they're unified in what? What's the thing that unifies them? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
What is it?
Yeah. What brings them together and what causes their community to be so cohesive? And the other thing they don't quite understand is we've never been as cohesive as we wanted to be, right?
But what is it that makes them cohesive?
What makes us cohesive is this idea that everybody is part of our family, right? So the very thing that should sort of assuage their fears, because every Latter-day Saint is taught from the time they're little that every person's a child of God and deserves dignity, is what unites us, but sort of frightens people too.
Right?
So that's the paradox, right? Is we want to be unified and we have to be unified to do what we need to do, but it's also the source of some of our opposition. Like if we're going back to the whole, why does the church have so much money? We're unified. We're working towards a goal. We've got a plan. When somebody walks up to you and says, hey, me and the other people have a plan, sometimes that's very unsettling.
Well, I think that too, like, because what is it that he tells them to do? You're going to go to the Ohio. And
Go to the Ohio.
Give you my law.
I'll give you my law.
But
I'll give you an endowment.
That's part of it.
Yeah.
I think that the law, like the city of Enoch, they didn't do anything crazy. They just kept the commandments.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like,
but it also sounds like the city of Enoch wasn't beloved by the other communities that surrounded it, that they found their unity frightening as well. Because there's passages in the book of Moses that talk about Enoch having to kind of defend the city, that the city was taken up so that it would be something that escapes from the wicked. And those passages resonate throughout the Doctrine and Covenants as well. This idea that on the one hand, we want to invite everybody to come unto Christ, but on the other hand, we want to go out of Babylon, remove ourselves from the world. And that's another one of those paradoxical relationships in the gospel where we love everybody, we want to reach everybody, but we also can't stay here forever.
But I think that it's an interesting conversation because the way that we can frame it of like the world, it almost, and I think that when people hear that, they think, oh, they're saying that I'm terrible, I'm wicked. But the word righteous, the word wicked, it's like, what is it like? Basically, righteous is like, it's more in reference to in good relationship with God, right? And it's more about they're willing to live a way that's actually beneficial as a whole. It's almost like the established standard is the best way for the community to work. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then I feel like the world is kind of like, it kind of is kind of selfish, right? It's like,
it's every man for himself.
Every man for himself. And we look around, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
You know, and like look around, there's a lot of poverty.
Yeah.
You know?
It's a fundamentally untenable system that eventually will collapse on itself. But it's that base instinct. It's the natural man that says, hey, I got to look out for me and mine before I look out for other people. When in reality, all of our great achievements have been based around this idea of, no, let's unite, let's work together. Now, have there been achievements that have been made on the backs of people that were forced to do those things? Yeah, they have. But the really great achievements, the things that we're striving for in the gospel of Jesus Christ, asks us to fundamentally look out for other people. And that's a shift in worldview. Like, honestly, the last couple of years in the political discourse in the United States has sort of been troubling, right? Because it's turned into a zero-sum game. Like,
I'm trying to win, you're trying to win.
Yeah, I'm just doing what's best for me, right? And in our better moments, it's when we've been united to say, we're doing what's best for us. We're going to do what we can to try and help the people around us and raise everybody up together. Consecration asks us to see the world through that lens where, hey, maybe I'm not going to turn out to be the richest guy in the street, or maybe I don't get a Maserati or whatever kind of car I want to drive. But when I live a consecrated life, I'm helping everybody around me increase and get better. And we see that pattern repeated again and again and again. Look at things like the Perpetual Education Fund. Look at the Pathways program that the church has launched. All these things are designed to empower people so that they have more power to go out and assist. Empowered people hopefully can build others. The way President Ezra Taft Benson says the world would take the poor out of the slums. Christ takes the slums out of the people, and then they take themselves out of the slums. Like, let's teach them who and what they are. Let's give them dignity. Let's help them understand their real nature and destiny, and then they'll be empowered to help themselves, and they'll be empowered to help others as they get better.
So okay. So far what I'm getting at is that this is a principle that can be applied a lot of different ways, but the overall purpose of it is for the benefit of the society.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just, but I think that's very contrary to what, like you said, the natural man is an enemy to God. And I think that that's where a lot of the fear is like, well, hey, how's that going to work? Just like they did with the Missourian, the way the Missourians responded, right?
Yeah. Is this going to end my way of life? Because when it comes down to it, the challenges between the church members and the Missourians was economic, right? what if we end slavery? Will that impact my way of life? Their economy was built around slavery, right? What if the Latter-day Saints are so united that they build a monopoly? And then, we have a Mormon mayor and a Mormon judge and everything like that. That's the type of rhetoric the Missourians were using. On the other hand, hopefully when the city of Zion is established, the vision that the saints were given, and this is found in around section 45 of the Doctrine and Covenants, is that everybody will flee to Zion. That instead of Zion being this closed society, we got ours, and we're going to make sure that our people are okay. It would be this place of refuge that everybody could come to too. And that's another part of consecration, is they were communities of consecration where everything's committed to God, but they were also places of refuge. Where that's a term that the Lord uses for Zion a lot in the Doctrine and Covenants too, is it a place of refuge? So when I teach in a class at BYU, I'll first of all ask everybody in the class, like, well, how many of you are getting assistance from the church right now? And, nobody raises their hand. And then you say, really? Everybody's getting assistance, right?
Yeah.
The church pays for this university. You go to BYU and every grounds crew seems like it has 5 more people than it needs, right? Because the whole place is one big consecrated experiment. The second question to ask then is BYU a place of refuge? Is it a place where a person can come and feel safe? Now, we don't change or lower our standards, but if a person's struggling, if a person's having a hard time, is this seen as a city of refuge, a place where they can come and get assistance? And that is another one of those paradoxical tensions in the gospel too, right? Where we're consecrated, so we're separated from the world, but we're welcoming people that need refuge among us so that we can help and heal them and hopefully get them to a point to where they can start to help other people too.
No, I think that this is good, because I think that when people think of church financials, I love that this pivot in perspective is around this doctrine or principle of consecration. It's way different than what you would ever expect, but it has to do with how the people really receive it, how the people are willing to do it. And it takes trust within people to be able to make it work. Because like you said, it's easy to be fearful of like, oh no, I don't know if it'll affect my economic situation. Yeah. But then with the example of BYU, it almost gives an example of, it's possible to do it this way. And many of us are receiving help. And I think that the consecration perspective actually allows us to stop. Tithing does this, right? That, everything that I'm getting is coming from God.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And another maybe big misunderstanding about consecration is how it relates to other economic systems. Like right now, the criticisms of church finance are, these guys are capitalists, right? They're just making a ton of money, and that's all they care about. That's why they have this huge financial reserve. If we were to go back in time, 50 or 60 years, the fear surrounding consecration were these guys are communists, right?
Yeah.
They're doing exactly what the Soviet Union and
they
those people
like each other.
are doing, right? They're pooling their resources, and they don't believe in capitalism. But consecration kind of takes the best of both worlds and involves it. Because this is a chart I draw in my class sometimes. I put like communism, capitalism, consecration. And the two things that every economic system struggles with are, one, we want to take care of the poor. We want to make sure that everybody is fed. Number two, we want to have personal freedom. Under capitalism, you got personal freedom, but you got a lot of people that are hungry, right? Under communism, and it never really worked, to be honest with you, but theoretically everybody's fed, but you don't have personal freedom. Consecration's big challenge is getting people to voluntarily commit to live in a way where they willingly sacrifice to help other people.
But that's
right?
it.
But that's the key.
That's
right?
the difference.
That's the sweet spot between we want to make sure everybody's taken care of, but we also want people to have personal freedom, is that you ask a person to willingly enter into consecration, and that's the best of both worlds. They're going to help out and make sure nobody starves to death, but they're going to do it not because there's a gun to their head. They're going to do it because they want to help, because they've made this commitment to God.
Well, this is the verse that makes me think of, because I feel like it's broken down into those three things, right? Mm-hmm. If you look at 45 or 42, verse 32, it's like the testimonies concerning the consecration of the properties of my church, that they cannot be taken from the church, agreeable to my commandments. Every man shall be made accountable. Number one is accountability unto me. a steward, so stewardship, a responsibility over their own property, or that which he has received by which you receive willingly, right? You receive it, right? It's not like it's forced upon you. So I think those are the main three things, right? Accountability, stewardship, and willingness, like your agency.
Yeah.
So
Like,
this isn't communism. But it's a stewardship. It's a responsibility.
It comes out of a person's desire to be good. Like, let me read this letter. This is a letter Joseph Smith wrote explaining how consecration worked on a practical level. He said, "The matter of consecration must be done by the mutual consent of both parties. For to give the bishop power to say how much every man shall have, and he be obliged to comply with the bishop's judgment, is giving the bishop more power than a king has." So he's saying, bishops, you can't go in and just order everybody around. Then he says, on the other hand, to let every man say how much he needs, and the bishop be obliged to comply with his judgment, is to throw Zion into confusion and make a slave of the bishop. The fact is, there must be a balance or equilibrium of power between the bishop and the people, and this harmony and goodwill may be preserved among you. So he's saying, on the one hand, the people that distribute the resources, the administrators of consecration, people like the bishop, can't just go in and say this, 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 and this. On the other hand, the people can't go in and say, gimme, gimme, gimme. There has to be this stated understanding where both parties go in and say, we're trying to do the most good we can for the greatest number of people. Let's work this system out together. And that was how consecration worked in the early church, and ideally how it works today. Like, it's okay for you, if a bishop asks you to, consecrate your time towards calling, to say, I just don't know if I can right now. That's you're right. But it's also good for you to say, well, let me shuffle things around a little bit, and maybe I can help out with that, where both people are going in with the idea to say yes, but they also are sensitive towards each other's needs. That's ideally how the system would work.
Well, to me, I even, to add to what you're saying, there are no kings. And even with the bishop with keys, they're seeking revelation. It's essentially saying, we are agreeing that God's running this. It's not some king. It's not some dictator. It's him.
Yeah.
And the revelation, and again, not every bishop's perfect. Not every leader's perfect.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And even in the past, in the history, like, they didn't always live it perfectly. I just think that even when you were saying it, just hit me. It was like, he is trying to help us practice understanding that he knows the way and he's leading the way.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. The third person,
third
person in the conversation is the Lord, right? And the bishop serving the Lord and the consecratee is serving the Lord as well. And they're both saying, how do we do what he would have us do? How do we love our fellow men with the limited resources that we have here? How can we get to do that?
Well, this sounds like it's so important, though, but it's like, what happens if we don't do it, though? Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Because I feel like you could say that might be the example of what you see in the world, right? Like, it's such an important principle. What is the thing that would happen if it doesn't happen?
Yeah, the scriptures teach that everybody's basically good, right? Like, another one of the teachings of the church that I love so much is this concept or idea of the light of Christ, that everybody is born with this intrinsic sense of what's right and what's wrong. If you read C.S. Lewis, he just called it the moral law. That was actually his evidence that God exists. Is why does everybody seem to automatically know right from wrong? But that light can be diminished and dimmed with bad decisions, with poor choices made. So everybody recognizes that poverty is bad, and that when people struggle, it's hard on them, it's hard on families, it can end lives. We all recognize that as bad, but we sometimes feel a little sort of powerless to help, and consecration is saying there's power in unity, and in using unified resources to assist people, we can make a difference. We can make the world better if we decide to pool our efforts.
I just mean that, like, for example, if, let's say, tithing is a part of the law of consecration, okay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I've heard people say things like, and I can understand what they're trying to say. They will say, like, well, what if we just stop paying tithing?
Yeah.
Right? We have enough money in the reserve. Why, like, there's so many people that are struggling financially.
Yeah.
Why can't we just keep it? Why can't, like, Imagine if you lived 10% more, how much more you'd be able to have to, if you wanted to choose to give.
Yeah.
Right? What would happen if we didn't pay tithing? I I remember Aaron Miller was saying, I think if you calculate it, whatever the number is, I think it would run out after like 8 years or something.
It would, and Aaron's done those calculations, and I admire him for doing it, but that misses the whole point.
Exactly.
Right? That it's the act of sacrifice. It's the act of tithing that actually changes the person. Like you and I talked about this, but I served as a bishop and you're currently serving, and there's some hesitation to talk about that.
I know.
Because, you don't want to hold yourself up like, oh, I was the quarterback of my high school football team.
So much
but
about
you learn so much.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, like I went in my first day as a bishop thinking consecration's a nice idea, but we haven't quite carried it out yet. After my first Sunday, oh yeah, we lived the law of consecration. When a family would come into me and they'd be struggling financially, when I was first serving, my first impulse was to say, maybe you shouldn't pay tithing for a little while. It's 10%. Let's get you back on your feet. As time progressed and the more I worked with people, I realized, no, that's what they should be doing. That's the first thing that I would suggest. And here's a couple practical reasons. Number one, if you have to set aside 10% of your income, you've just created a budget. A lot of the people that came in and asked me for assistance weren't budgeting their money or seeing where it was going. Setting aside 10% forces you to sit down and say, what do we have? What's 10% of it? And then it's
stewardship. I mean, that's that stewardship principle to me.
It's pretty easy from there to say, well, how much do we need for rent? And how much do we need for groceries? And bam, now you're managing your finances. And a lot of times that was enough to just They just weren't paying attention to where their money came from. The second thing was I just saw real blessings. And I want to emphasize here that we don't believe in a prosperity gospel. Like we don't believe if a person pays tithing, they're going to be rich. You and I haven't seen that happen.
There's actual research that it does increase. But I mean, I know that it does, but I think it's because you see the world differently.
Yeah.
You notice opportunities. I don't think it's like the intention is not to be rich, because again, it's the societal perspective of how we can eliminate poverty generally.
Yeah,
right?
but that's a negative spin on consecration, right? Some churches actually go to you and say, hey, if God loves you, you'll be rich. That's not what our church teaches. We ask people to give 10% because God asked them to give 10%. We're not saying, and it's going to make you rich. We're saying if you do that, God will help. And I've seen that. I haven't ever gotten rich, but we've always been like even Stevens. We've had trouble in this area.
Amply supplied.
We've been amply supplied, but I'm not the richest guy on the block, and I probably never will be. And I don't think consecration is supposed to produce billionaires. I think it runs contrary to the idea. So when they started to pay tithing, like something would happen, that week. What do you think
they
found a job?
But what do you think it is that changes? Because I believe what you're saying.
Yeah.
Because it is.
I believe that God wants his children to be taken care of. I don't think he wants them to be rich necessarily, because that can be very corrosive to a person if it's not handled right. Love of money is the root of all evil. But I think the Lord wants us to be, like you said, amply supplied. And when a person takes the step of faith to make a sacrifice like paying tithing, I saw it again and again and again. I saw it where something happened. Something in their situation changed. Some opportunity came along, or maybe it was just a shift in their attitude towards their own self-esteem, towards their own feelings. I just didn't see anything that helped people lift themselves out of financial difficulty faster. So yeah, at first when I was serving as a bishop, I just cringed when I would say, well, you're paying your tithing. But by the time my term was up, you know what? I had no hesitation saying, let's start paying tithing. That's the first step to get you back onto solid ground, because I just didn't see anything that was more effective in helping them when it came down to it.
What is it though?
I don't know. I mean, it's an act of faith. And I think part of the reason why it gets brought up so much as kind of I did this, then I got this blessing, is because it's one of the most direct ways that we can show faith in the Lord, right? Is to say, hey, I'm going to give this up. Because I mean, you and I were both teachers. That's not an incredibly lucrative profession.
And it's all relative.
And it's all relative. But in making that sacrifice, I just have always felt like I'm going to be taken care of if this happens. Not I'm going to be rich, not, oh, this is the first step on the road to being a millionaire, baby. But it was me saying, I'm making money less important. And because of that, I appreciate what is important, and I recognize that God's going to help me find what really matters in my life.
To me, even this conversation is solidifying it even more. I believe that it changes our perspective of God.
Yeah.
Which then elevates what we see every day.
Yeah.
We notice his hand more clearly. We notice opportunities more clearly. There's so many times where opportunities just pass us by, but it's almost like it's that I, the Lord, am bound when you do what I say. When you do not what I say, you have no promise. It's like we have the assurance of his promise. He promises us that the windows of heaven will be open. He promises us that we'll have not enough room to receive it. And that could be financial, that could be a lot of different things, but it is a promise that we can expect, right? If we are obedient and sacrificing to that degree.
Yeah, and what you said right now just made me realize, boy, maybe I was wrong in calling tithing a financial law. Maybe we should say both tithing and consecration are holistic in the sense that tithing is financial and that it's 10% of your income. But if you're looking for the blessings of tithing to be solely financial, you've maybe missed the point of the law, right? The blessings that come from tithing can be spiritual, they can be emotional, they can come when it comes from health. They can come in a number of ways, and people need to have their eyes open. And maybe what tithing does that's advantageous is have us kind of create that sacrifice blessing model to the point to where our eyes start to open and we start to see all the things that we have and all the blessings that we've been given. Like early on in my marriage, my wife lost her wedding ring. And, this was when we were totally gift of the magi, dirt poor. And we didn't have any money to pay for another one. And we spent the whole night looking for it. And I remember my wife literally cried herself to sleep because that ring was the one nice thing that we had. We were living in the upper half of a person's house that we could just barely afford. We had conversations to say, how do we replace the ring? Do we put off tithing to get you a ring? And we made the decision, no, we've committed to do this. We're going to do it. And seeing this as you're saying this, your perspective is even shifting in the conversation of what you're saying. Yeah, your perspective starts to shift to where you say, well, we don't have this nice thing that we had anymore, but it was just a thing. When it comes down to it, a diamond's a rock. We have each other and we love each other and we're healthy. And you know what? This is going to ruin the story, but we did find the ring. It was one of those experiences early on in our marriage that just reinforced this to me, where my wife called and said, well, how can we get the money to buy another ring? And I said, I don't know, but I think we should pay tithing. And she was like, you're right. And then I walked into the room and the ring was in our sock drawer or something like that.
This to me just reveals, I just am thinking, God does not care about physical things.
He really doesn't.
You think that he's going to show up and we're going to give him some cash?
Yeah.
We're not. He doesn't, money hasn't even always existed.
Yeah.
But what has always existed is us. And I feel like it helps us to focus on that.
Yeah. What do you get the guy who has everything? What do you give God?
What do you give him?
Who owns the universe and everything that exists in?
He's laughing like $1 billion.
Who cares?
I made the earth. Do you think I need $1 billion? Oh, maybe the leaders need the money.
Yeah.
But they spend all day, every day ministering to people. I mean,
yeah, it's this model that, again,
it's a perspective.
When it comes down to is consecration means to make sacred, and maybe it makes you see your income as sacred or your possessions as sacred, but making them sacred just means understanding who they really belong to begin with and how he wants to use them. God's given me this gift. I can fix cars. God's given me this money. How do I use it to try and accomplish God's purposes? And when you're in the service of your fellow beings, you're in the service of God.
Yeah, I think that that's so important to remember. Now that we're on the topic here, I think it'd be interesting to consider what is I think it'd be good to break down some specifics. We've already mentioned a few, but what are the things that we know of, even historically, right, of ways that people have applied the law of consecration to be of benefit to the Lord's people?
Yeah.
right?
Well, and I wanted to go back to the first question you asked, where you said, why are Latter-day Saints so financially successful? We haven't always been. When a person looks through the history of the church, they see a lot of ups and downs. And sometimes, like our current time right now, we're doing great because of consecration. There's been other times when we have descended into what looks like possible financial ruin because of the law of consecration. The saints weren't the most fabulously rich people when they were at winter quarters in 1846 and 1847. But what does the Lord tell them? Section 136 of the Doctrine and Covenants is given to Brigham Young, and the Lord says, cleave to your covenants. What were the covenants they made? Before everybody left Nauvoo, they had gone through the Nauvoo temple, and they had been committed to live the law of consecration. And now they're in the wilderness, starving to death, and the Lord says, the way to solve this is through consecration. You guys pool your resources, bring everybody together. Don't worry about getting to the valley. First, make sure that everybody gets there together and that we're all there. That's part of consecration as well, right? That sometimes Latter-day Saints have passed up huge financial landfalls because we were more concerned about making sure that everybody was okay and that we were helped. Brigham Young, for instance, is sometimes criticized, for being as much a businessman as he was a spiritual leader. But if you read his sermons and his writings, that guy was really committed to consecration. To the point to where he would say stuff like, let's pool our resources so people can immigrate from England. Hey, you guys in this town, I need you to start living the law of consecration. Hey, when he found out that there were immigrants trapped on the plains in the middle of a snowstorm, he got up and said, your professions of religion don't mean anything. The sermon today is go bring them in from the plains.
The real thing.
Yeah.
The action.
Yeah. And what causes a person to stand up in the middle of a church meeting and go home and hitch up their wagon and drive into a blinding blizzard to save somebody they don't even know? It's the covenant of consecration. It's the idea that your life, your possessions, and everything that you have don't belong to you. They belong to someone else. And that person is trying to make sure everybody's okay, not just that you're okay.
I love in section 38, I can't remember exactly the way he mentions it. He goes, the world is my footstool.
Yeah.
And I will stand upon it. He says, it's like I made the earth, and to me, it's not the thing. You are the thing.
Yeah.
And even in Moses 7, he's weeping, he's crying. After he talks about in section 8 and then verse 18, and then Enoch's like, why are you crying? And he's like, my people, they're using their agency to hate each other, to come against each other. They don't want to choose me.
Yeah.
And I'm weeping for that. I'm paraphrasing. He wants us to be united.
Yeah.
Right?
He wants everybody in a good place where they can live a happy life and then gain eternal life afterwards. And I mean, just the fact that, Moses 7 presents this community, and then it presents this God who doesn't just kind of sit back and go, well, this is going to be interesting.
Yeah.
Who's watching people suffer and weeping alongside of them is so powerful. It just really makes it, if we're really letting these principles sink into our heart, it makes it impossible for us to see a person suffering and be like, that's not my problem.
Well, he says, you're doing it unto me.
Yeah.
And he in that section, I was noticing, like he calls him out. He's like, look, you're not 100% right with me. In section 38, I think. And he's like, but I'm still with you. And whoever wants to be, again, I'm just trying to point out this idea that this is a societal, the commandments are societal. Mm-hmm. The temple covenants are societal.
Yeah.
And I think that too often, maybe what the misconception is the misconception that I see in a pattern in many areas where, when I sin, it's just about me. Like we're going to be in heaven with God alone. No, we're going to be there with a lot of people.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's what he's trying to get us to understand.
Yeah, even the idea of salvation, of heaven, becomes really selfish, right? If you're just thinking, well, I'm going to get to heaven. Like you've seen that episode of Seinfeld where the guy gets his girlfriend to steal the newspaper because he's Christian. He's like, well, I'm not going to hell. So you go steal.
It's about what I'm worried that but that's what I'm saying. That's the mindset. I think, well, do you have enough money?
Yeah.
I need to make sure I eat.
Yeah.
And he's like, I made the whole earth.
Yeah.
There's so much for everyone.
Yeah.
And the reason why it's unbalanced, people used to live in tribes and they ate every day.
Yeah.
And they were happy.
The Lord in Moses 7 and other places basically says, if you make it to heaven, great. What's even better? Let's get everybody there.
Yeah.
Let's save a community, and in doing so, you'll probably save yourself. I mean, I think a lot about, when I served a mission in Florida, and they had these mega churches, that were just absolutely huge.
The Bible Belt,
20,000 people show up, and it's because there's this electric preacher that really, really knows the scriptures and is charismatic. In our congregations, if there's more than 200 people attending, we split it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We don't want a mega church because the idea is when we start to get too big, we lose that sense of community. Like sometimes people's complaint about the church is everybody's always up in each other's business all the time. But that's the idea. You're supposed to have a group of people who know each other and care about each other and are always up in each other's business. And that's another iteration of the Law of Consecration that you and I have discussed, is when a person is given a ministering assignment or a calling, if they have an understanding of consecration, it's different. They're not just checking a box off their list. I'm going to send a text to brother, sister, so-and-so and make sure they're okay. They're saying, I've been made by covenant to look after these people. Are they all right? That makes a huge difference in how we see things.
It is more than, you didn't say this directly just now, but it is more than just the financial. It is all of the ways that we help take care of each other. It's almost like a law, like gravity to me. Like instead of it being a commandment, like we think of the commandments as rules, right? But this is like, he's saying these connections matter.
This is the way it is.
My connection with you should emulate the way you, because of the gratitude you have of that, it should affect the way that I connect, that you connect with everyone else. And that is what makes the community work.
Yeah.
That's what makes Zion, right? But what would you say, like how does the Law of Consecration, like how would you say that, like bringing this kind of a little full circle to a degree, how does it attribute to the financial success of the church?
Well,
and its mission overall, I would say.
First of all, let's take those words, financial success. What does that mean?
Yeah.
What is financial success? Does it mean that we have a ton of money? We got a ton of money. All right, I guess we're successful. Does it mean we're helping people? Money's just a thing. It doesn't really matter that much in the grand scheme, but it is a thing that allows us to affect circumstances and change people nowadays. And so what is success for the church? God would say, my work and my glory is to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of man. So I don't think people should be offended when people like Elder Bednar say, we do a lot of charity, but we're not a charitable organization. Our goal is the salvation of mankind. We want to alleviate human suffering along the way too. But we've got to keep our eyes on both of those things as well. At the same time, it's really hard for a person to separate the physical and the spiritual. The Revelations of the Doctrine and Covenants set up this other dichotomy where sometimes we say things like, we're not physical beings having a spiritual experience, we're spiritual beings having a physical experience. But the Doctrine and Covenants has passages where the Lord says stuff like, I've never really given you a spiritual commandment. I've never given you a temporal commandment. All my commandments are spiritual. If a person isn't getting enough food, it's hard for them to focus on the spiritual things that lead them into God's presence. And honestly, I saw it again and again with people in my ward. If someone was really worried about losing their apartment or where their next meal was going to come from, it was really, really hard for them to make it to church and to sit and feel peace in sacrament meeting while they were taking the sacrament. So sometimes we separate the spiritual and the physical because it's a useful dichotomy. But the Lord's essentially saying it's sort of both, right? In the state that we're in right now, in the physical bodies that we exist in, it's difficult for us to be spiritually whole without being physically well. Now there are examples of that. You got like Neil A. Maxwell has cancer and his physical body is wasting away, but spiritually he's doing great. But a lot of the times we've got to recognize the connection between those two. Elder Uchtdorf says physical and temporal things are two sides of the same coin. And we've got to recognize that if we're going to church and everybody's doing great spiritually, but there's somebody who's suffering temporally, we're not successful. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And finance is a way to get there. The idea isn't to be the most financially successful organization in the world. It's to be the most consecrated organization in the world, to recognize what finance is and how it's useful and how it's not useful, to see money and resources and wealth as ways to help people and not just hoard it so that it corrupts us is the basic idea here.
Yeah, I mean, money makes good people better, bad people worse. I really believe that.
Yeah, it really does.
And it reveals what's already there on the inside. But it's bigger from what I'm understanding what you're saying. It's not even the success is the change. Because I think it's interesting. This is the thing that I thought was so interesting.
Yeah.
When it came to the sequence, right? They don't even know there's going to be a temple. But he's preparing, he's establishing the order. Then he calls the bishop. Then he's like, okay, I need you to build a temple.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, okay. Now they understand the concept of consecration. That's what they do to build a temple. But then they kind of abandon the temple. But it doesn't abandon what the temple did to them.
Yeah, yeah.
It's still in them.
I mean,
that's what and then ultimately they enter into the presence, like he'd say, like in 109, Jesus appears in the Kirtland Temple.
Yeah.
110.
He appears in the Kirtland Temple,
appears
the
in
very first temple of the church.
The dedication is 109. And then he appears in 110, which is the same thing that happened to Enoch. But that's what he wants for
that's
his
what
people.
We're going for, right?
Like he wants to prepare them to be in his presence.
Yeah. Because, I mean, going back to this idea of Zion, we made a little video on Zion. Scott Woodward and I went to Missouri and we filmed about the city of Zion and talked about the design of it. And that's still an idea that generates a lot of excitement among the saints. Like that video.
Yeah, where is Zion?
Couple hundred that where is Zion? But I still think we're sort of missing the point here because now we've got to ask ourselves, what is Zion? Like they're in the middle.
Location could be, yeah. I mean,
yeah, they're in the middle of building it in Missouri when Section 97 comes, and I think this is a key text where the saints were kind of like, yeah, we're here and our neighbors are a little peeved at us, but we can't be kicked out of this place because this is the land of Zion, right? We have a prophetic destiny. And in Section 97, verse 21, the Lord says to them, this is Zion, the pure in heart. In other words, the city isn't the real estate. I've been to Independence, Missouri. It's a great place. I still believe God's going to build the city of Zion there. But the city is the people, right? God doesn't really care about sidewalks and bushes and trees. And I'll even come out and say temples are secondary, right?
Yeah.
Those buildings don't mean anything unless they're helping to create a pure people that can make it. So did the project to build Zion fail? In some senses, yeah, they got kicked out of Jackson County. They never built Zion. We still haven't built it if it's supposed to be built there. But it never failed in the sense that the real project Zion was to create a people pure in heart, a people that look at their neighbor and say, hey, my first priority is to make sure that guy's okay. Because that's what Jesus Christ would do. That God doesn't care about trees and bushes and sidewalks and temples. A city is the people. And once we get the people, I don't think there's going to be any problem getting the land. The Lord will open the ways.
Secondary.
Yeah, that's secondary, right? And so there's some wonderful and well-meaning members of the church who said, I've got to move to Missouri. I got to go there because we're supposed to build Zion. I would say, I think the Lord wants you to build Zion right where you're at. And when we're ready, if and when that takes place, the command will come. But right now, the fact that Zion is still in process means that we aren't quite there yet. But there's as much to be gained on traveling the road to Zion as living in Zion. A lot of people don't make it all the way there, but that wasn't the point to begin with. The point was to become Zion.
Yeah, I love that. And we know that the church has, so there's an individual effort that you didn't say this word for word, but there's an individual effort that affects us individually on how we then go out. We have this personal connection with God. He gives us a commandment. We are willing to obey that based on what we understand of how it affects others. He's so merciful to us. We want to be merciful to others. He gives us so much. We want to help give it to others. That's what I feel like tithing does. Oh, I'm so grateful that you've given me this. Now I want to help the whole entire effort. And even now, like you have President Johnson on a larger scale doing the same thing. We're so thankful that God's blessed us with so much help. Their sister, President Johnson of the Relief Society.
Camille Johnson. Yeah.
Camille Johnson. She's has a law background, right? She could be just, hanging out, but she's now full-time going around the world leading an effort to help with poverty around the world. And what's it like 55 million or something like that?
That's consecration, right?
That's consecration.
Someone with Sister Johnson's skill set should be out there banking as many billable hours as she can so she can have a nicer car and a nicer house and everything like that. But instead, because she's a consecrated person, she's flying to Pakistan and she's, preparing a speech and conference. Sister Johnson actually showed up one of my classes at BYU once because she wanted to be in touch with what the young people were feeling and experiencing. Like, honestly, that's a consecrated effort. Money is a means to an end for her. It's not the end itself.
Well, I think that it's important to consider this question here. Like, why do you think this would be important, not just for members of the church, but for the whole world to understand this principle? And what kind of effect do you think that would have? Like, what would the world be like if everybody lived this way?
Oh, man, it would definitely be a different place, right? It would definitely be a different place. And I think about that at oftentimes, like, we can teach people this. We can teach people this, and to the extent that they accept into their heart, it's transformative and it's changing. But what's even better than that? To get people to covenant to do it, right? I think everybody intrinsically in their gut, because they have the light of Christ, knows that giving of themselves to help others is the right thing to do. But there's a big difference between me saying that's the right thing to do and entering into a covenant to actually do it, right? Now I'm entering into a system. Now I'm becoming part of an organization. It's the difference between, somebody saying the Nazis are bad and someone saying, well, I'm going to join the army so that I can stop them, My grandpa fought in World War II. He believed in the cause of democracy, but he didn't just sit there and kind of, what they're doing over there is terrible. He signed up. He joined the organization and he went off to do what he could in an organized fashion to help. What the church basically asks people to do is say, you know what's right. Now let's enlist you in the cause. Let's make you a ministering brother or sister so that you're going out and you're checking on people, making sure they're okay. Let's make you a welfare specialist. Let's make you a Relief Society president. Your mom's a Relief Society president.
Yeah, she is.
She probably spends a fair amount of her time consecrating.
It's affected the way she interacts with our family too.
Yeah.
It's like she is different in her willingness to help. She always has been.
Yeah.
But she's even more than she was before, and alongside of what she's doing now. It's changing her is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I just got back from leading this church history tour, and we're at Niagara Falls looking at one of the most majestic things I've seen. There's a lady who's a Relief Society president who's over there texting like, oh man, we got to make sure that Sister so-and-so gets her order and so her kids have food. That's consecration, We're here at one of the natural wonders of the world that everybody longs to see their entire life. But what's she focused on? Her neighbor. She gets that Niagara Falls is a beautiful thing that will eventually go away, but her neighbor is an eternal thing. And she correctly adjusted her priorities. And so that's what living a consecrated life means. It's that you recognize what really matters and you put your efforts towards helping that in a unified effort to assist people. You don't just do it willy-nilly. You don't just hand out dollar bills on the street because that's a good thing to do. But you enlist in an organization that allows you to have a genuine impact on the world.
And it does.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that inside out, not outside in. The inside individual changes, and then they willingly go and they want the good for others too.
Yeah.
But back to the financial side, though, I think the Lord does increase the resource to do the thing. I think we look at people like Elon Musk. Man, it's interesting because he has $1 billion, but the question is, how much does it cost to do the thing that he's trying to do? He's trying to go to Mars. That costs a lot of money,
yeah.
Right? But helping the world eliminate poverty isn't cheap, right? And I think that God is patient with us to allow our hearts to change, to be willing to help.
It's a school to help us become like God.
Shoot, right? I don't think $100 billion is enough. I don't think it's enough. And I think I like the principle that he mentions in section 42, where we can't be idle either. It's almost like we can't just sit around and expect God to just give us stuff. It made me think when you were saying earlier, I was like, oh, it just gave me a different perspective of grace, right? A lot of like, we need to give everything. Like, Christ gave everything. And he's inviting us to do the same.
Yeah.
Because in Moroni 7, he says, and when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. And I think that's what he's trying to do.
Yeah. There's a quote you and I shared earlier. God, this is Spencer W. Kimball, God does notice us and he watches over us, but it's usually through another person that he meets our needs. So when we say we'll see him and we'll know him because we'll be like him, how do we become like him? By doing the things that he would do, by being his hands to go out. There's this really poignant story where, the Christus up on Temple Square, this mentally imbalanced person ran into the visitor center with a ball-peen hammer and he knocked the arms off the Christus. And they eventually repaired it. You can still see the line. But in the meantime, one of the missionaries on Temple Square hung a sign on the Christus that said, "I have no hands but yours." And that's a powerful lesson to basically communicate that, hey, it's one thing for God to just drop a bunch of blessings into this person's lap. But what if God can help two people by giving blessings to another person through this person? Then that multiplies, it becomes exponential. And he's helped both the giver and the receiver to draw closer to him. One gets the thing that they need to be okay. The other gets the power and understanding of how good it is to give to other people. There's a lost teaching of Jesus that Paul mentions. It's not in the Gospels, but in the book of Acts, Paul says Jesus taught it's better to give than to receive. And that's a consecrated viewpoint too, right? Instead of showing up at church and saying, what am I going to get out of this? Like, what does this experience have for me? You're showing up at church and saying, what can I do today to help somebody else? What can I give so that somebody has a good experience today?
And that's how Jesus lives.
Yeah.
Right? What would you say, what would be like the one thing? Obviously there's a lot of things, but what would be the biggest message that you think would help people the most?
J. Reuben Clark said the fundamental principle of the law of consecration is that everything we have belongs to the Lord. And that is the first thing that I would start with is you don't just, and by the way, my mind goes to, that means my iPad belongs to the Lord. That means my car and my house belong to the Lord. But I would also hope that I would look and say, wait, I belong to him. And I'm an instrument that he can use to bless and help other people. And when I talk to my children, who I have no doubt that one of the primary things the Lord has asked me to do is take care of these eternal beings and make sure they're okay. I'm teaching them the same thing, to understand, hey, it's good to have things, and you're not a bad person if you want to go to the store and buy another stuffed animal, but just recognize that the reason why we have things is to do things to help other people, that everything we have really belongs to God. And if you spend your life trying to attain material things or thinking that material things are going to fill that void that exists in all of us, it's in vain. There's that poignant story when the Savior had that rich young man come to him and said, "Master, what can I do to gain eternal life?" "Sell all that thou hast and give it to the poor." And the guy walked away. He didn't really understand that what he actually had wasn't his. It already belongs to God, and it's going to go back to him, and you're a temporary steward. So why not use it right now to build something that really does last? There's this old saying that you die 3 times. You die once when you die, and once when you're placed in the ground, and the third time is the last time anybody ever utters your name, right? Scary thought. But we believe in eternity, and we believe that people last for eternity, and the way you actually make a lasting impact is by helping people, not acquiring goods. That shouldn't be the primary driving force in our lives. The primary driving force in our lives should be to help others become like God. That's consecration.
Amen. Listen, I won't add anything to that. The only thing that I will add is at the end of every episode, I say, I believe that what we said is true. I really believe in this this principle of consecration. I'm not perfect at it, but I'm willing to try. Willing to try.
Yeah.
But don't take our word for it. It's up to you to find out for yourself. This is Let's Get Real. Until next time.